Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. If you've watched The Big Picture at all over the past several years, you've no doubt heard me talk about how, in my experience, journalism has changed over the years. And in my opinion, it's not been a change for the better. Most of those words have been aimed at television news as it's evolved. But news coverage in general, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad, seems to have shifted. Now, everything changes. Just ask my daughter when I tell her she spends too much time on the phone every day. Change is inevitable. The older we get, the more we realize it and the less we like it. But like it or not, we can't stop it. When it comes to the news, however, we can change where we get it, or even if we pay attention. My guest on this big picture has been a journalist long enough to either agree with me or tell me where I'm way off base. He comes from a different side of the news business, but news is news. Bob McCarthy has worked at the Buffalo News for 41 years. He's just retired from the news after being its political reporter for certainly as long as I can remember. So I want to welcome to the show Bob McCarthy. It's been a pleasure having you on the in the studio, not once but twice this week.
Yeah, good to be here.
And I said in my intro that newspaper journalism, television journalism, it's news. News is news. We come at it from different technological angles, but I've talked about journalism a lot over the past several years on the show and how I've perceived it evolving. And it would be interesting to see another journalist who's been in the business as long as I have, what your observations are in terms of how, when you started out versus now that you've just retired, how it's changed, how the business has changed.
That's a really interesting question because a lot of the kind of surrounding things have changed. And you take the Buffalo News, where at one point, not that long ago, we were selling 325,000 daily copies and 400,000 on the weekends. And that's changed a lot. That's really, really compressed now. But the whole technological change of the web has been a good thing for newspapers, because I remember when we had to wait till the morning paper to get a story in and hope that nobody beat us on the 11 o'clock news on TV. That's all changed because the paper has the ability to instantaneously run a story and even announce a really good story on Twitter or something and say, tune in with us. So those things have changed, Phil, but the core things, I don't think so. I think that newspaper reporters still try to get the story first, to be fair and accurate with it, and to do a good job writing it. And I think that's basically what it comes down to. Nothing's changed on that since the first story I ever wrote.
Well, one of the things that is clearly different in my experience, and this is, I think I'm going to give the advantage to newspapers on this, because even though I've been, TV journalist most of my career, when I first started out, reporters came from newspapers. That's where we got our guys from, because they knew how to research a story and get the details and then tell the story. Newspaper journalists have a feel for telling the story more completely. You have the luxury of telling the story more long form.
Right.
TV journalists, if you can't tell it in 2 minutes or less,
right,
it doesn't get on the air.
Sure.
And so that you really have to condense it. And that sometimes doesn't do justice to the news. You guys have an advantage in terms of you can get into the details and really explain things.
Especially, I think, covering politics the way I did for 30 years, Phil, was you really had to delve into the details sometimes. I read our story just today about all of the issues that are facing the state legislature and the governor as they try to adopt a budget. And I don't know that that could be done in a broadcast situation as well as Chris Bragg did it for us this week. And so those are important things. You know, and talked about all the different things that are holding up this budget, and this whole idea of natural gas in new construction and things like that, which are very complicated things. And that's why I think it's good that we have this ability still to be able to do that. And the newspaper is the best form, and even on the web, I think it's a good way for us to do that. That's always going to be there.
One of the things that I've criticized consistently over the past several years is in television news. Again, when I started, we used to have journalists come over from newspapers, and they knew how to tell a story. They knew how to give details and how to make it understandable. In television news, there's been an evolution, and they've gotten away from reporters that have that background, you know, and quite frankly, the reporters that came over from newspapers weren't that glamorous. And that's putting it kind of
I know.
kindly.
We all have faces for newspapers. Yeah.
But they knew how to tell a story, and today and over the last not just a few years, it's been longer than that, the tendency for TV broadcasters has been to hire younger people who look good, who can talk, you know, who can read, and they send them out and do a story, but then the knowledge factor isn't necessarily there, the understanding. So they basically kind of do a Cliff Notes type of story.
Yeah, and so many TV reporters kind of bounce around to different cities also, and that probably adds to it. But I think that I think that especially newspaper reporters are often assigned beats, and that they are required to know their stuff on a beat, whether it was politics for me or our court reporters, who I think were always tremendous and always had a leg up on TV because they were always looking at those court documents every day and seeing what was in there and finding a good story in there. So I think that that's one of the advantages that has always been there for newspaper reporters, that they know their stuff. And they're not sent out, well, they're not sent out on general things every day. People are, of course, stuff happens and you go out and cover things. But for the most part, you got people who are very familiar with their subject and are able to report on it with some authority and some expertise, as opposed to kind of the quick and dirty hit that you might get. And that's not taken away from what TV does, because they do what they do very well, especially in this city, I think.
Well, the evolution that I talked about with TV was, it came down to an extent, it was a budget thing, because the younger reporters, granted, they looked better and, you know, they had an appeal on TV, and, not quite as much knowledge, but they were less expensive to hire than the guys who had been around for a long time, and you know, their earnings went up. Has that tendency been the same with newspapers at all?
I don't see it. And, you know, it's interesting that at the Buffalo News, for the most part, people come to the news and stay. People have careers of 30 and 40 years. There are very few who go on to the New York Times or the Washington Post. It happens. And it's a good paper to come from if you want to do that. But I would say that most people who come to the Buffalo News find a home there. And they find Buffalo is a good place. I mean, I'm not from Buffalo, but I've been here for 41 years now. And I'm very happy to be here. But the News, throughout its history, has been a good paying paper and represented by the Guild, and a good place to work. And so therefore, that has been one of its strengths, I think, throughout all the years.
That's interesting you say that, because when I was first in television, I talked to some people, some veteran reporters who had worked in larger markets, you know, Philadelphia, Chicago, bigger markets. And they came to Buffalo, and they said, you know, people might think we're crazy to come to Buffalo, which is a smaller market, but the people in Buffalo, and this is very important, people in Buffalo do not realize the quality of life that we have here. People come back to Buffalo when they move away.
That's true.
Because people in Buffalo don't realize what a traffic jam is. Really, it's amazing, but you have to live somewhere else to know how good we have it here. Now, we may have bad weather once in a while, but we don't have earthquakes, we don't have hurricanes.
And it's still a pretty big city, too,
and we have great theater, we have good restaurants, you've got skiing in the winter, you've got boating in the summer. There's a lot of quality of life in Buffalo. So it's a good market to work.
I agree. As far as the newspaper business goes, also the News has always been, as I said, a very good paying paper, and it's always had a great reputation, and people like to come here to work. So.
You know, when the Courier Express was still in the market, there were a couple of papers, there was competition. When that ended, when there was just the Buffalo Evening News and then the Buffalo News, and it was by itself, did that change the way the editorial content was, or anything about the way the paper was run?
I worked for the News for about 4 or 5 months before the Courier went down, and I got a taste of what real big-time, big-city newspaper competition was, especially in a death struggle like that, because there was only going to be one paper that was going to survive at that point in time in this city, especially as things were really beginning to, as the economy was really beginning to suffer in Buffalo. So everybody knew it. And I came to the News in 1982 from the Olean Times-Herald, and I asked that of Murray Light, who was the editor at the time. I said, you know, everybody says this is going to be a one-newspaper town soon. And he says, I guarantee you, the News will be the surviving paper. And there was no joy at One News Plaza the day that the Courier closed. It was a horrible day that I will remember always as people being sad for all our brothers and sisters at the Courier. But I don't think that things changed that much. The News survived because it was the better paper. And as it turned out, we learned that TV was competition also, and that radio was competition. And then certainly by the time the digital age came along, we had a whole new type of competition that we had to deal with. But I don't think that, you know, the day the Courier went out, I remember I worked on the first Sunrise edition, and it was go out and get the story and get it in there and get it right and get it fast and make sure that we do it right so people will come back and read it again tomorrow. You know, that's the whole idea behind it. So, sure, some things changed. You know, we didn't have the same competition. There wasn't somebody in the police press room where I worked that might scoop me, and boy, were you scared of that. Of course, that changed. But, you know, we still, I think, felt we had the responsibility to get it fast and get it right.
Responsibility, you know, that's a word that's very interesting, because in journalism, that's something that when I started, that was part of the job description. You know, we were responsible. We were kind of a service to the community. We're out of time in this segment. When we come back, we're going to talk about journalism being a service to the community, maybe the idea of bias in journalism, and if that's a perception that's accurate or not. When we come back. Interesting.
It's good.
Welcome back to The Big Picture. My guest is Bob McCarthy, who is the political reporter for many, many years for the Buffalo News. And we're going to get right into the tough stuff here.
Yeah, right.
You know, the Buffalo News, you know, has had, right or wrong, people that I've talked to think that it's got a left-leaning editorial slant. And I think what that comes from, not necessarily just the writing in the Buffalo News, but the New York Times and the Washington Post have what perceivably might be called a left-leaning slant. I think that might not be a stretch. And most of the national articles are from those two papers. So that gives the Buffalo News that, that kind of color. Would you agree, or maybe not?
Well, this is something that I've dealt with all of my days at the News. And it probably comes from the stand that the editorial board takes on the editorial page. Mm-hmm. And the editorials that, quite often lean towards the left, towards toward Democratic side. Although there are many other times too when I've seen it just the opposite, including real questions that the editorial board at the News have always raised about how things are done in Albany, especially by the whole Democratic establishment there. And I can remember endorsements for George Pataki as a Republican gubernatorial candidate. If that feeling comes, if that feeling develops, it's from the editorial side of things. And that's okay. The editorial people can take whatever stand they want on any issue of the day, and that's their right. And you'll see other papers, especially throughout upstate New York, that will take a more conservative view of things. But as far as the news coverage goes at the News, no, it's right down the middle, I think. And any time that I ever wrote a story, if I even got anywhere as close to taking a stand on something, I would be called on the carpet for it. But I didn't. I would never do that, because that's the way I survived, especially in the political realm for 30 years, by just right down the middle with it, because that's the only way you can survive, I think. You start veering off into what you think is what is right and what is wrong, as far as politics goes, then you're asking for trouble. It's not to say that I can't recognize something that's wrong out there and write a story to expose it, but you're going to do it in a pretty fair way.
When you watch TV news on the cable or on the networks, do you see any bias? Do you ever?
Sure, I do. Yeah, I mean, my goodness, you got Fox on this side and MSNBC on the other end, and that's kind of like the sad aspect of what has happened to the news business in recent years, because people gravitate towards those things to support their own viewpoints. And the straight down the middle has begun to lose readers and viewers because people go to get their own views affirmed on either the left or the right. There's nothing wrong with that either. It's the way, you can say whatever you want on TV because this is America, and you can. But it has been to the detriment of straight down the middle journalism, such as newspapers.
When there is a bias, as you say, on MSNBC or Fox or the main networks, whatever, and sometimes it's more subtle because it's not just how a story is told, it's the stories that they decide to tell or the stories that they leave out. Some of the coverages that are spotlighted or chosen, not to be covered. Is truth in journalism, does that take a hit, or are you just seeing two views of the same thing that you have to sort through to find the truth?
Well, let's take a look at what the criticism aimed at Fox News is right now, especially with regard to their coverage of the last presidential election and whether it was a legitimate election or not. We're finding out now from this lawsuit, this Dominion lawsuit, that there are very clear indications that Fox reporters and anchors were saying one thing on the air and then expressing a different opinion in their emails among themselves, where they said among themselves that, no, there's no question about whether this election was fraudulent or not. And the shameful part of it, Phil, I think, is that there was this feeling at Fox that they had to cater to their audience and tell them what they wanted to hear, even if it wasn't true. And that to me is very troubling.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that, but I know lately they've been talking about, for instance, the January 6th thing at the Capitol.
Right, that's all part of it too.
Yeah, and I know if you tune into CNN or MSNBC, you'll hear how violent it was, and one side of it, and then if you tune into Tucker Carlson or Fox, you'll see another side of it, and they both have video to back up what they're talking about. And it's interesting because the video is the video, and you can choose which video you want to show, but the video that they show backs up what they're saying. Yeah. And so it really takes something to sort through what the middle is. And for instance, and I'm going to talk about this on another show, the guy that was arrested and is now serving up to 4 years in jail, that QAnon shaman, the guy with the horns. He was painted, MSNBC, CNN, he was painted as a violent leader of this insurrection, this riot. And then Fox News came on with video showing him calmly walking through the Capitol with a couple of police officers. And they're opening doors for him, and they're showing him around, and it's very calm. And there's a lot of footage of him just basically calmly walking around, and they show him offering a prayer to a group in the main chamber saying, God bless these police officers for letting us in, and please, behave and give thanks to these police because they've been very nice to us. And that video wasn't altered at all, and it shows him being very courteous and calm and getting along with the police, 2 at a time, and sometimes 6 or 7 of them around him. And so, on the other hand, they're showing him, not being violent, but looking like he's outrageous, and you're not quite sure what to believe here.
Well, I'm not going to delve into that because I'm not an expert in that particular event, except I do know that was a real problem on January 6th at the Capitol. I can't think anybody could ever back off from that. But I'll give you another example that I think one of the refreshing things that's been going on in the news business lately about stories regarding the contention that the election was stolen. You'll see on most stories now will say and they will just come right out and call it a false accusation. Or they might even call it a lie because that's the truth. And it's been proven in the vast majority of court cases that revolved around those claims. So I think that's been something that newspaper stories especially don't dance around anymore. They've been able to confront it with the facts and say that these are lies.
Okay, we've got about 3 minutes, 2.5 minutes left. Where do you think journalism is going? And do you think that in the immediate or not so immediate future, journalism has got a bright future, or is it going to basically degrade because of financial considerations? Is there any way to predict?
I'm worried about it, I'm sitting here retired all of a sudden, which was something that I wasn't really planning on, but some economics decided that I would be given a chance to take a buyout and go, and so I'm gone. But I wasn't planning on it. And as a result, we've seen a reduction in our news staff at the news, and that's happening in a lot of other newspapers and TV stations too. So I am worried about it, but I do think that there's always going to be a place for us. The Buffalo News, I'm not sure if it's going to be printed on dead trees forever. I think it's going to have a place on the web, and it's going to be a force the way it is now with the largest news gathering staff in upstate New York. I don't see that changing, and I don't see that changing even if we go to an all-web publication someday. I don't see where we won't be setting the agenda for news coverage in Western New York. But it's not ever going to be the glory days, especially from the financial standpoint. And that's a problem. And how do you attract people to try to make a career out of it and make a living out of it? I think there will be a way for it and a place for it, but nobody's really figured it out yet. And that remains to be seen how it's going to work. But it'll be really something to watch, that's for sure.
Well, the one thing for sure is change is, you can't get away from it.
No, you can't. You can't. I've learned that. I've been around long enough to know that, and that's part of the deal. It just is.
I think in one respect, I think there'll probably be a kind of a coming together between the electronic media and the newspapers, because newspapers, like you say, the print edition may be going away. That's going to make it electronic. The broadcast is already electronic, but that's going to merge into, they're both going towards the internet coverage. It's
who knows what lies ahead.
It's going to kind of come together, I think.
And people are constantly saying to me, well, the paper isn't what it used to be. No, it isn't. It's changed. But you know what? You also get a digital edition that gives you instantaneous news and so many other features that are interactive with video, and there's who knows what lies ahead there. And even though our print edition has changed, all right, okay, it's still better than any other peer newspaper, I think, in the Northeast for sure. And you still, don't forget that this digital thing that we have embraced and are still perfecting is got so much potential on it that it's unlimited, I believe.
Well, we're out of time for this big picture. One thing I'm hoping is there'll always be a place for the professional in journalism.
Me too.
Somebody who can get the details right and get into the gist of what's important in a story.
Good.
I want to thank you for watching The Big Picture. I want to thank Bob McCarthy for being my guest. Thanks for watching WBBZ. We really appreciate it, as we're your local TV station. And we'll see you next time on The Big Picture.